The maps were wrong. Not inaccurate, wrong in a way that shouldn't be possible. When Charles Hapgood, professor of history at Keene State College in New Hampshire, presented his analysis of the Peary-Reese map to the Cartographic Division of the United States Air Force in 1960, the response he received was not dismissal. It was confirmation. Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, Lieutenant Colonel, 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, wrote back in a letter dated July 6, 1960, now declassified and available through the Air Force Historical Archive, that the map showed Antarctica's coastline with an accuracy that matched their own aerial surveys. Surveys conducted with 20th century equipment. The Peary-Reese map was drawn in 1513. Antarctica under the ice. The coastline that exists beneath 2 miles of glacial coverage. Somebody mapped it before the ice was there, before the question of who, the question of when. The Antarctic ice sheet in its current form is approximately 34 million years old in its basic existence, but the specific coastal configuration shown on Peary-Reese corresponds to a period geologists date to approximately 12,000 years ago. The end of the Younger Dryas, the boundary event that separated whatever came before from everything we call history. 12,000 years ago, something ended. We know this from ice cores, from ocean sediment cores, from the simultaneous extinction of 35 genera of large mammals across 4 continents within a geological instant. We know something ended. We don't know what was there before it ended. That gap, between 12,000 years ago and the beginning of recorded history around 5,000 years ago, is where the question lives. And the question is not whether an advanced civilization existed before us. The question is what happened to it. Graham Hancock gets cited constantly in this context, and then dismissed just as constantly. But the dismissal usually targets his conclusions, not his evidence. The evidence itself, the Peary-Reese map, the Oronteus-Phineas map of 1531 showing Antarctica with river systems, the Bouch map of 1737 showing the continent divided by a waterway that matches subglacial topography, confirmed by seismic survey in 1958. This evidence doesn't go away when you dismiss Hancock. It sits there, in archives, in the cartographic collection of the Library of Congress, available to anyone with a reader's card and enough patience to look at what the maps actually show. Someone mapped subglacial Antarctica. This is a fact. Who did it and when? That's the question nobody officially answers. Now the geology. Because the maps are interesting, but the geology is harder to dismiss and less discussed. In 1996, geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University, not a fringe researcher, a tenured academic with a peer-reviewed publication record, published his analysis of the weathering on the Great Sphinx of Giza in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt. His conclusion, based on the erosion pattern on the Sphinx enclosure walls, was that the weathering was caused by prolonged rainfall. Not wind erosion, rainfall erosion. Vertical precipitation erosion, leaving rounded profiles consistent with water weathering over centuries, not the sharp horizontal profiles left by desert wind abrasion. The problem with this conclusion is simple and devastating. Egypt has been desert for approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years. The last period of sufficient rainfall to cause the weathering pattern Schoch identified was the African humid period, which ended around 5000 BCE. For the Sphinx to show that weathering pattern, it has to be older than 5000 BCE, significantly older. The Egyptological establishment responded to Schoch not with counter-evidence, but with authority. Zahi Hawass, then Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, stated that Schoch was wrong because the Sphinx was built by Khafra in approximately 2500 BCE, and that was that. When pressed on the weathering evidence, Hawass said Schoch was not an Egyptologist and therefore not qualified to comment. Schoch is a geologist. The weathering is a geological question. The expertise argument was backwards. The weathering is still there. The enclosure walls still show rainfall erosion. The African humid period still ended around 5000 BCE. Something built the Sphinx, or at minimum, carved the enclosure, before the desert came. before what we call Egyptian civilization, before 5000 BCE, which puts us into that gap again. The same gap the Piri-Reis map points to. 12,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. 7,000 years of near total silence in the human record. 7,000 years is not nothing. Modern civilization in its current form is approximately 500 years old if you date it from the scientific revolution. 7,000 years is 14 times that. 14 times the span of everything from Copernicus to now, and we have almost no record of what was happening. That absence of record is itself data. Absence is data. And the specific shape of that absence, what's missing, where the gaps are, what the surviving fragments point toward, tells a story that's more specific than something was there. Now Göbekli Tepe. Because Göbekli Tepe changed everything in 1994 when Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute began excavations, and the academic world has still not finished processing what it means. The site is in southeastern Turkey, at 37 degrees north latitude, 38 degrees east longitude. It consists of at least 20 circular enclosures. Only 6 have been excavated, the remainder identified through ground-penetrating radar, each containing massive T-shaped limestone pillars up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, covered with intricate relief carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human hands. The date is the problem. Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 11,600 years ago. This is not contested. It comes from radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the construction fill. 11,600 years ago. That's before agriculture, before pottery, before writing, before any of the technological prerequisites that archaeological models say are necessary before you can organize the labor force required to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton monoliths with precision sufficient to align them astronomically. The astronomical alignment is the second problem. Klaus Schmidt noted before his death in 2014 that certain pillar arrangements show possible astronomical orientations. Andrew Collins, working with astrophysicist Rodney Hale, published analysis in 2013 demonstrating that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are oriented toward Cygnus, specifically toward the star Deneb as it appeared in the sky 11,000 years ago, when Deneb occupied the position of the north celestial pole due to the precession of the equinoxes. Precession of the equinoxes takes 25,920 years for a complete cycle. To align a structure with where Deneb was 11,000 years ago, you need to know where the celestial pole was 11,000 years ago. That requires understanding precession. Understanding precession requires centuries of careful astronomical observation and a mathematical framework sufficient to model the slow wobble of Earth's axis. Hunter-gatherers with no pottery did not independently develop precessional astronomy and then build 20-ton astronomical observatories with relief sculpture. The model breaks. Something is missing from the model. Schmidt himself, in interviews before his death, said that Göbekli Tepe suggested the existence of what he called a lost civilization of the mind, a tradition of knowledge that predated the site and made it possible. He didn't say aliens. He said a lost tradition. Knowledge that came from somewhere before. Where before is the question that stays open. Now, the underwater archaeology. Because while Göbekli Tepe is on land and therefore accessible, the majority of the continental shelf, land that was above water during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, is now submerged. The land where people would have lived during the last ice age, coastal areas near fresh water and resources, is now under the ocean. Glenn Milne of Durham University and Mark Maslin of University College London published analysis in 2003 in Nature, demonstrating that the global sea level rise between 21,000 and 7,000 years ago submerged approximately 27 million square kilometers of land, an area roughly equivalent to the continent of Africa. Whatever was built on that land is now underwater. What's been found underwater is not nothing. In 2001, marine archaeologist Sundaresh and a team from the National Institute of Oceanography in India, working with sonar and diving surveys in the Gulf of Khambhat off the coast of Gujarat, identified a submerged site at a depth of approximately 40 meters, covering an area of roughly 9 kilometers by 2 kilometers. The site showed what appeared to be geometric structures: walls, a possible grid pattern, right angles not consistent with natural formation. Artifacts recovered from the site during dredging operations included pottery, beads, a carved piece of wood that returned a radiocarbon date of approximately 9,500 years BCE. Not 9,500 years old, 9,500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. Contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, underwater off the coast of India. The Indian government did not follow up the discovery with systematic excavation. The site remains largely unexplored. The artifacts are in storage at the NIO in Goa. The wood with the radiocarbon date of 9,500 BCE exists physically. It has been dated. The date has not been retracted. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, a massive stone structure was discovered by dive instructor Kihachiro Aratake in 1986. The Yonaguni Monument, as it became known, consists of a series of stepped terraces, right angles, parallel walls, and what appears to be a road carved into the rock at a depth of between 5 and 40 meters. It is approximately 150 meters long, 40 meters wide, and 27 meters tall. The debate about whether it is natural or artificial has not been resolved. Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus spent years diving the site and concluded it showed signs of human construction: tool marks, quarrying evidence, a possible carved face. Robert Schoch, the same geologist who analyzed the Sphinx, dove the site and concluded it was primarily natural, enhanced by human modification. Even Schoch's more conservative position, natural formation with human modification, implies human presence at Yonaguni when it was above water. Yonaguni was above water approximately 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. The gap again. Everything points to the same gap. Now the genetic evidence. Because archaeology looks at what was built, but genetics looks at what survived. And what genetics shows about human populations during the period between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago is deeply strange in ways that don't get discussed enough outside specialist literature. David Reich of Harvard Medical School, in his 2018 book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, published by Pantheon, describes what ancient DNA analysis has revealed about population movements and replacements in prehistoric Europe and Asia. The picture is not gradual development of local populations. It is repeated replacement. Populations that existed for thousands of years disappearing and being replaced by populations with entirely different genetic signatures, within what the DNA record shows as geological instants. The most dramatic example is Europe around 4,500 BCE, the beginning of the Bronze Age. The people who built Stonehenge, who constructed the megalithic monuments of Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe, they were almost entirely replaced within a few centuries by people from the Pontic steppe. Almost entirely. The DNA of Neolithic Britain simply stops appearing. The people who knew how to build Stonehenge, who possessed whatever tradition of knowledge made Stonehenge possible, are gone. Replaced. Their knowledge replaced with them. This is not the only replacement. It happened multiple times, in multiple places, with different populations. A civilization does not need to be destroyed by a flood to disappear. It can be replaced, its people absorbed or killed, its knowledge traditions ending with the last person who held them. The Tocharians, an Indo-European people whose mummies, with light hair and Western features, were found in the Tarim Basin in western China, dating to approximately 4,000 years ago, appeared genetically isolated, unrelated to surrounding populations, speaking a language that belongs to an early branch of Indo-European. Where they came from, how they arrived in the Tarim Basin, what knowledge they carried, the genetic trail ends. They're simply there. And then they're gone, absorbed into the populations that surrounded them. The Basques of northern Spain and southern France have a genetic signature that separates them sharply from all surrounding European populations. Their language, Euskara, is a language isolate, unrelated to any other language on Earth. Not distantly related, unrelated. It has no known common ancestor with any other living language. Whatever linguistic tradition produced Euskara either emerged independently or carries a tradition so old that all cognate languages have disappeared. The Basques were in that region before the Indo-European replacement, before the Neolithic farmers who came before them. They held a position that was held before history begins. What the Basques know that nobody else knows, if anything, is not recorded. Their oral traditions, like all oral traditions, carry information encoded in ways that require the tradition itself to decode. When the tradition breaks, as it partially broke under Roman conquest and later Frankish and Spanish pressure, the encoding goes with it. This is how knowledge ends, not in fire, in silence, in the last person who knew dying before passing it on, in the tradition breaking before the encoding is written down, in the gap between what was held and what was transmitted. Now the question of what specifically was known. Because every civilization that survives in any form in the historical record, Egypt, Sumer, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, begins at a level of complexity that the standard model has difficulty explaining. They don't gradually develop writing, mathematics, astronomy, and monumental architecture over millennia of incremental progress. They appear, already complex, already sophisticated, already knowing things that took modern science centuries to rediscover. The Sumerians knew the heliocentric structure of the solar system, not as an established scientific fact, as mythological reality encoded in the structure of their cosmology, in the number and characteristics of the planets they described. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of this is contested and in many details wrong, but the underlying observation that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was more sophisticated than it should have been for a civilization with no telescopes and 4,000 years before Copernicus is not wrong. It's a real anomaly. The Egyptians knew pi. The Great Pyramid's base perimeter, divided by twice its height, gives 3.14159 pi to 5 significant figures. The ratio of the pyramid's height to its base perimeter is the same as the ratio of a circle's radius to its circumference. This is not coincidence at the level of precision achieved. It was built in. The people who designed the Great Pyramid knew pi. They also knew, encoded in the pyramid's dimensions, the circumference of the Earth. The pyramid's base perimeter, at 143,200 scale, gives the circumference of the Earth at the equator to within 0.1% accuracy. 0.1%, the circumference of the Earth. In a building constructed approximately 4,500 years ago. The standard explanation is that this is coincidence, or that the Egyptians arrived at these numbers through practical measurement without understanding the mathematical relationships. This explanation requires the coincidences to pile on top of each other. Pi and the circumference of the Earth and the polar radius of the Earth and the speed of light encoded in the geographic position of the Great Pyramid, as has been identified by various researchers, and which the mainstream archaeological position treats as selective numerology. The mainstream position may be right, but the mainstream position requires accepting a remarkable density of coincidences without examination. The alternative, that the people who built the pyramid were encoding knowledge they possessed into a structure designed to preserve it indefinitely, requires a civilization sophisticated enough to possess that knowledge before the historical record begins. Which brings everything back to the gap. 12,000 years ago to 5,000 years ago. 7,000 years. The period when sea levels rose 120 meters, when 27 million square kilometers of coastal land was submerged, when 35 genera of large mammals went extinct, when the Younger Dryas event killed something that the ice cores record as a near-global catastrophe. And then, when it was over, when the climate stabilized, when the sea level stopped rising, civilization appeared, fully formed, already knowing things. The most parsimonious explanation, not the most comfortable but the most parsimonious, is that the knowledge came from before, from whatever existed in the gap, from survivors of whatever ended 12,000 years ago, carrying what they remembered into a world that had to be rebuilt from scratch, encoding what they knew into stone and myth and astronomical alignments and ritual traditions because those were the only media that would last. Survivors encoding what they remembered. Sound familiar? Ziusudra in Dilmun, carrying the Nam of the first humans, transmitted through the priestly line, the line that does not break. The civilization before humans, or before historical humans, before the humans the record begins with, didn't disappear. It compressed into survivors, into encoded knowledge, into the traditions that the earliest historical civilizations already possessed when history begins, into the myths that every culture on Earth shares, the flood myth, the golden age before the flood, the gods who came from the water and taught, and then left, and promised to return. Plato wrote about Atlantis in the Timaeus and Critias, approximately 360 BCE. He attributed the story to Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais. The priests told Solon that Athens had once defeated Atlantis, a great civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and that both civilizations had been destroyed by the catastrophe 9,000 years before Solon's time. 9,000 years before Solon, approximately 9,600 BCE, which is 11,600 years ago. 11,600 years ago. Göbekli Tepe, the Younger Dryas boundary event, the end of whatever came before. Plato was not writing science fiction. He was a serious philosopher writing in a tradition that valued transmitted knowledge. The Egyptian priests at Sais were operating a tradition of record-keeping that they told Solon went back further than Greek civilization could remember. They had records, physical records, in a climate that preserves records. What those records contained, what the full archive of the temple at Sais held, before the library at Alexandria burned and took with it everything that had been collected and copied over centuries, is now gone. The library at Alexandria burned multiple times. The most significant damage came from Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, which burned the books stored near the harbor. Subsequent burnings under Aurelian in 270 CE, under Theophilus in 391 CE, under the Arab conquest in 642 CE, each taking more. By the time the last fire came, what remained was fragments of fragments. Copies of copies of copies, with errors accumulating at each generation. What was in the full archive of Alexandria, what the original collection contained before the first fire, is not recoverable. But the catalog survives in part. Callimachus of Cyrene compiled the Pinakes, a catalog of the library's holdings, in the 3rd century BCE. The Pinakes itself survives only in fragments and references. But from those fragments, scholars have identified categories of texts that no longer exist in any form. Texts on pre-Diluvian history, texts attributed to authors with no other surviving work, texts described as translations of documents in languages that cannot be identified. Pre-Diluvian history, the period before the flood, before the gap, before 12,000 years ago. Somebody wrote about it. The texts existed. They were in Alexandria. They burned. What remains is the structure of what's missing, the shape of the absence. The Piri-Reis map drawn from source maps that no longer exist. The Sphinx, weathered by rain in a desert. The pyramid encoding knowledge that shouldn't have been known. The myths that shouldn't agree but do. The flood, the teachers from the water, the knowledge preserved, the promise to return. The civilization before is not a hypothesis. It's the only explanation that makes the evidence coherent. Everything else requires more coincidence than the alternative. What it was, how sophisticated, how widespread, what it knew that we don't know yet. Those questions stay open. The subglacial coastline of Antarctica was mapped. The circumference of the Earth was known. The precessional cycle of 25,920 years was understood well enough to align Göbekli Tepe with where Deneb was 11,000 years ago. Something understood these things, and then it was gone. Compressed into survivors and stone and myth and the encoded traditions that the first historical civilizations already possessed when history began. Compressed into the priestly lines that carried knowledge through the dark period, into the Basque language that has no relatives, into the Tocharians alone in the Tarim Basin, into the mummies of the Canary Islands, the Guanche, with their mummification practices and their solar calendar and their genetic profile that doesn't fit neatly into any known migration pattern, who told the Spanish conquistadors when they arrived in the 15th century that their ancestors had always been there and had come originally from a land to the west that sank into the sea. A land to the west that sank into the sea. The Guanche said this to the Spanish in the 15th century. They had no way to know about Plato, no way to know about the Egyptian priests at Sais, no way to know what the Sumerian texts said about what came before the flood. But they said the same thing. The structure of what's missing is not random. The gaps all point in the same direction. The myths all carry the same memory. The maps show the same coastline. The stone encodes the same knowledge. Something was there. And the survivors knew it, carried it, encoded it, passed it through the line that does not break, through the priestly traditions, through the astronomical alignments, through the myths, through the stone. Namgara nu ubtabeen. What is embedded does not get extracted back. The civilization before left something in us. Not metaphorically, in the structure of what we know and don't know why we know it. In the mathematics that feels like remembering, not learning. In the myths that feel like history with the names changed. In the stone that was placed with a precision we are still trying to understand. It left something, and every time we get close enough to see what, the last few feet before the subglacial coastline, the last line before the flood, the seventh Upkalu without his determinative, something stops us. Or we stop ourselves. The maps were drawn, the stone was placed, the knowledge was encoded. It's weight. The stone remembers differently than text remembers. Text can be burned. Alexandria proved that. Text can be mistranslated, redacted, lost in transmission, deliberately altered by the people who control the copying. Stone doesn't burn. Stone doesn't mistranslate. Stone just sits there, holding what was put into it, waiting for someone with the right instruments to ask the right questions. The right instruments arrived recently, and what they're finding in the stone is making certain people very uncomfortable in very specific ways. In 2022, a team from the University of Birmingham, led by archaeologist Vince Gaffney, published results from a non-invasive ground-penetrating radar survey of the area surrounding Stonehenge. Not Stonehenge itself, the surrounding landscape, within a 2-kilometer radius. What they found beneath the surface had not been visible before because nobody had looked with sufficient resolution. Buried pits, buried post holes, buried structures consistent with timber monuments predating the stone circle by thousands of years. The oldest features in the Stonehenge landscape date to approximately 8,500 years ago, 3,000 years before the first stones were erected. 3,000 years of continuous use of that specific location before the monument we know was built. Why that location? Why return to the same spot for 3,000 years before deciding to put permanent stone there? The standard answer is sacred landscape, the chalk downs, the river Avon, the particular topography. This is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't explain why that specific point, why that specific alignment, with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset on the same axis. Why the builders of the final stone phase, around 2500 BCE, chose to align the monument with astronomical events rather than with the local topography. Because aligning with astronomy means aligning with something that doesn't change. Topography changes, rivers move, forests grow and burn, coastlines shift. But the relationship between Stonehenge and the midsummer solstice sunrise is the same now as it was 4,500 years ago. It will be the same in 4,500 years from now. The builders chose permanence. They chose to encode something that would outlast any text, any oral tradition, any political structure. What they encoded, beyond the solstice alignment, which is obvious, is still being decoded. Anthony Johnson of Oxford, working with computerized geometric analysis published in 2008, found that the ground plan of Stonehenge encodes a series of Pythagorean triangles. Not approximations, precise Pythagorean relationships, using integer ratios embedded in the placement of the stones. The Pythagorean theorem as a formal mathematical concept is attributed to Pythagoras, approximately 570 BCE. Stonehenge was built approximately 2,500 BCE, 2,000 years before Pythagoras, with Pythagorean geometry embedded in the ground plan, the same pattern that appears in the Great Pyramid. Knowledge encoded in stone that predates the historical attribution of that knowledge by millennia, which means either the knowledge was developed independently multiple times, by the Egyptians, by the builders of Stonehenge, by the designers of Göbekli Tepe, or it came from a common source that predates all of them. A common source that predates all of them. The civilization before. Now Antarctica. Because Antarctica is where the most concrete physical evidence of the civilization before may be located, and it is also the most inaccessible, the most politically controlled, and the most systematically underfunded for the specific kind of research that would answer the question definitively. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed by 12 nations and now adhered to by 54, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve. No military activity, no territorial claims, no resource extraction. The treaty is renewed and has been in continuous force since 1961. Under it, a rotating system of national research stations operates across the continent. McMurdo Station, Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, Vostok, Concordia, dozens of others. What those stations have found beneath the ice is documented, and in some cases, classified at the national security level. The subglacial topography of Antarctica, the shape of the land surface under 2 miles of ice, has been mapped through radar surveys, most comprehensively by the BEDMAP project, with BEDMAP 2 published in 2013 by the British Antarctic Survey in the journal The Cryosphere. BEDMAP 2 shows a continent with mountain ranges, plains, valleys, river systems, a landscape of extraordinary complexity under the ice. A landscape that was above water and ice-free during the period we're discussing. What BEDMAP 2 doesn't show is what's on that landscape. The survey measures the shape of the bedrock through the ice. It does not show surface features at the resolution necessary to identify archaeological remains. For that, you would need something different. A different frequency, a different methodology, a longer survey time at lower altitude. That survey has not been conducted, at least not publicly. The United States, British, Australian, Norwegian, and other Antarctic programs have conducted extensive aerial surveys of the continent. The full data from those surveys is not fully public. Selected datasets are released. The complete high-resolution radar records are held by the national programs. What the complete records show, whether they show anything that would be relevant to the question of pre-human or prehistorical human presence in Antarctica, is unknown publicly. The people who have seen the complete records are bound by the administrative structures of the national programs that employ them. They don't speak publicly about what they've seen or haven't seen. This is not necessarily sinister. National programs classify operational data for reasons that have nothing to do with covering up ancient civilizations. But the classification exists. The complete data is not public, and the specific research, systematic high-resolution archaeological survey of the subglacial landscape, has not been conducted publicly by any program. Admiral Richard Byrd. His name comes up in every discussion of Antarctic anomalies, usually in the context of his alleged statement about a land of mystery beyond the South Pole. Byrd conducted 4 major Antarctic expeditions: 1928, 1933, 1939, and 1946. And his 1946 expedition, Operation High Jump, involved 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. The largest military operation ever conducted in Antarctica. Officially, a training exercise and mapping mission. What Byrd actually found during Operation High Jump is documented in his diary, portions of which are held at the Ohio State University Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center. Portions, not all. The complete diary has not been released. In the portions that are available, Byrd describes anomalous readings from magnetic instruments and thermal surveys that indicated subsurface features inconsistent with the known geology. He recommended follow-up investigation. The follow-up was not conducted under his command. Operation High Jump ended abruptly, 8 months ahead of schedule, in February 1947. Why Operation High Jump ended 8 months early has never been officially explained. The Navy stated that conditions were worse than anticipated. Byrd made no public statement about the reason for early termination. He died in 1957. His complete diary remains partially restricted. What he found beneath the ice, if anything, is in those restricted portions. Or it isn't, and the early termination was purely logistical. Both possibilities exist. The restricted portions exist. That is a fact. Now the myth structure. Because wherever physical evidence ends, the myth structure begins. And the myth structure of the civilization before is more consistent across geographically separated cultures than any diffusion model easily explains. Every culture on Earth with a sufficient oral tradition has a flood myth. This is documented. The Babylonian flood in Atrahasis, the Hebrew flood in Genesis, the Greek flood of Deucalion, the Hindu flood of Manu, the Chinese flood of Gunyu, the Mesoamerican flood in the Popol Vuh, the flood traditions of Australian Aboriginal peoples, some of which describe specific coastal geography that was submerged when sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum. Geography that has been confirmed by marine survey, and that the oral traditions preserved accurately for 10,000 years. 10,000 years of accurate geographic memory in oral tradition. The Aboriginal traditions of southeastern Australia describe a time when the land extended further into what is now the sea, when specific landmarks existed that are now underwater, when the relationship between land and water was different. These traditions have been analyzed by Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and Nick Reed of the University of New England, with results published in the Journal of Quaternary Science in 2016. Their conclusion, that the Aboriginal traditions preserved accurate memory of coastal geography from approximately 7,000 to 18,000 years ago, means that oral tradition can carry accurate information across timescales that academic history assumed impossible. If oral tradition can accurately preserve coastal geography for 18,000 years, what else has it preserved? What else is encoded in the myths that every culture shares? Not as coincidence, not as parallel independent development, but as transmitted memory from the period before the flood, before the gap, before history began. The teachers who came from the water. Every culture has them. The Sumerians had the Apkallu, 7 beings from the Abzu who taught writing, science, law. The Babylonians had Oannes specifically, the fishman who emerged from the sea and taught everything. The Dogon people of Mali have the Nomo, amphibious beings who came from the sky and water and transmitted knowledge. The Mesoamericans have Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, bringer of knowledge, who came from across the sea. The Andean traditions have Viracocha, who appeared from Lake Titicaca after a great flood and taught agriculture, architecture, and the calendar before disappearing back into the water. Different names, different geographies, different artistic traditions and iconographic styles, but the same figure. The teacher who came from outside, transmitted knowledge, and left with the promise or the implication of return. This is not the kind of coincidence that happens by accident. Independent invention of the same specific story element. Teachers from water who bring civilization and then leave. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, cultures with no documented contact, is not a satisfactory explanation. The alternative explanation, that the story is a memory, a preserved transmission of something that actually happened, requires taking myth seriously as historical evidence, which academic history is structurally resistant to doing. But the Aboriginal coastline evidence changes that calculus. If myth can preserve accurate geographic memory for 18,000 years, the resistance to treating flood myths and teacher from water myths as potential historical memory becomes harder to justify solely on methodological grounds. Now, the specific question of what the civilization before knew that we don't, or knew and we've recovered only partially. Cymatics. The relationship between sound and physical form. In 1967, Swiss scientist Hans Jenny published Kymatic, translated as cymatics, demonstrating that sound frequencies applied to physical media produce specific geometric patterns. Different frequencies produce different patterns. The patterns are reproducible. The same frequency applied to the same medium always produces the same pattern. Sand on a vibrating plate at 432 Hz produces a specific geometric form. At 528 Hz, a different form. The forms are consistent, elegant, and in many cases match the geometric motifs found in ancient temple architecture across cultures. The Chladni figures, as they're also known, named after Ernst Chladni, who first described them in 1787, appear in the carved stonework of Roslin Chapel in Scotland, in Islamic geometric tilework, in the mandalas of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, in the geometric patterns of Australian Aboriginal sand art. The specific frequencies that produce specific Chladni figures, when applied to water, produce forms that match the geometric patterns carved on megalithic stones across Europe. This is not proof of anything specific, but it suggests that certain ancient artistic traditions encoded acoustic knowledge of the relationship between sound frequencies and physical form in visual media, which implies someone understood cymatics in a systematic way before Hans Jenny formalized it in 1967. Understanding cymatics at that level requires instrumentation or methodology for producing controlled frequencies and observing their effects on physical media. It requires systematic investigation over time. It requires something that looks like science, before what we call science. The acoustic properties of stone circles have been studied systematically only recently. Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield and Bruno Fazenda published analysis of Stonehenge's acoustic properties in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 2012. Their acoustic modeling of Stonehenge in its original complete form, with all the stones in place, before centuries of collapse and removal, showed that the monument created specific acoustic effects. Sound reflected and focused within the circle in ways inconsistent with accidental placement. Specific frequencies resonated. The monument was acoustically designed. Acoustically designed. Not just astronomically aligned, not just geometrically precise, acoustically functional, built to do something with sound that required knowing, in advance, what specific stone placement would produce specific acoustic effects. This level of intentional design, astronomical, geometric, acoustic, simultaneously, does not emerge from a people with no prior tradition of this knowledge. It requires inherited knowledge, transmitted knowledge, knowledge from before. The knowledge from before is what the priestly lines carried, what the Upkalu transmitted, what the survivors of the civilization before encoded in stone and myth and ritual, because text burns and stone does not. Because the line had to survive not years or centuries but millennia, long enough for the world to restabilize, for sea levels to settle, for new civilizations to emerge from the survivors and the populations they merged with. Long enough for the knowledge to be needed again. The question of when it's needed again, when the seventh transmission can complete without being interrupted by the flood, is the question the Tablet of Destiny's seventh condition addresses. The condition that's broken off. The condition that Ithaca hasn't been applied to yet. When people finally... what? The civilization before didn't die. It compressed. Into the stone that encodes pi and the circumference of the earth. Into the myths that every culture shares without having shared them. Into the acoustic chambers built to do something specific with sound. Into the subglacial coastline that someone mapped before the ice came. Into the priestly lines that carried the Nam through the dark period. Into the oral traditions that preserved accurate coastal geography for 18,000 years. Into the gap between what we know and why we know it. Into the mathematics that feels like remembering. The Guanche said their ancestors came from a land to the west that sank into the sea. The Egyptian priests at Sais told Solon the same story 9,000 years earlier. The Sumerians said the Apkallu came from the water before the flood. The Aboriginal Australians describe coastlines that are now underwater. Plato wrote down what the priests said and was dismissed as allegorical for 2,000 years. Until marine survey confirmed the subglacial topography of Antarctica matches the Piri-Reis map, that matches the Oronteus-Phineus map, that matches nothing that should have been possible to draw in 1513 or 1531. The maps were wrong. Then they were right. Then they were confirmed by the United States Air Force in a letter dated July 6, 1960, that has been sitting in the historical archive ever since, available to anyone willing to look. The stone remembers. The maps remember. The myths remember. The DNA of the Basques and the Tocharians and the Guanche remembers something that the standard model of human prehistory doesn't have room for yet. It's making room. Not because someone decided to make room. Because Nam Gara Nu Ubta Bayan. What is embedded does not get extracted back. The civilization before embedded something in us, and in the stone, and in the myths. It's coming back to the surface now, through ground-penetrating radar at Stonehenge, through Nero-Seti reading 100,000 tablets, through marine archaeologists finding right angles at 40 meters depth off the coast of Gujarat, through geneticists mapping population replacements that delete knowledge traditions along with the people who hold them. Coming to the surface. Not because anyone planned it, because that's what embedded things do. They surface. The deepest part of this isn't the maps. It isn't the stone. It isn't even the myths. The deepest part is the number. Not a symbolic number, a specific number appearing in traditions separated by oceans and millennia. Traditions with no documented contact, traditions that should not share anything, and yet they share this. The number 25,920. The Hindus call it the Mahayuga cycle, the great year, the full precession of the equinoxes. 25,920 years. The Babylonians built their mathematical system around a base 60 counting structure, and the number 25,920 divides evenly and elegantly into base 60 mathematics. 432 times 60, or 72 times 360. The Norse mythological tradition describes Valhalla with 540 doors, through each of which 800 warriors pass to fight at Ragnarok. 540 times 800 equals 432,000, which is 25,920 times something specific. The Hindu Kali Yuga, the current age of the world, lasts 432,000 years. The Babylonian kings before the flood ruled for a total of 432,000 years across all their reigns combined, as recorded in the Sumerian king list. 432,000, 25,920, 72. These numbers appear in Norse cosmology, Hindu cosmology, Babylonian chronology, the Sumerian king list, the architectural dimensions of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, where the causeway measures 432 cubits, and in the acoustic frequency research of Hans Jenny, where 432 Hz produces the specific Chladni figures that appear in ancient temple stonework. Somebody knew the precessional cycle. Somebody understood it well enough to encode it in mythology, in architecture, in musical frequency, in astronomical alignment. Understanding the precessional cycle, the 25,920-year wobble of Earth's axis, requires centuries of systematic astronomical observation, careful record-keeping, a mathematical framework, institutional continuity across generations sufficient to accumulate the data. This is not what hunter-gatherers do. This is what civilizations do. Giorgio de Santillana was professor of history of science at MIT. Hertha von Dechend was professor of the history of science at Frankfurt. In 1969, they published Hamlet's Mill through Gambit Press, a work of scholarship so dense and so uncomfortable in its implications that it has been simultaneously praised and ignored for 50 years. Their argument, built from cross-cultural mythological analysis across dozens of traditions, was that ancient myth worldwide encodes sophisticated astronomical knowledge, specifically processional knowledge, in narrative form. That the stories of gods and heroes are not primitive explanations of natural phenomena, but are instead mnemonic systems for preserving astronomical data across time. The mill in the title, the world mill, appearing in Norse, Finnish, Greek, Indian, and Polynesian mythology, is the procession. The slow grinding of the cosmic mill, which takes 25,920 years for a complete turn, was encoded in myth because myth survives when records don't. When libraries burn, when civilizations collapse, when the gap comes. De Santillana and von Dechend spent 20 years on this work. They were not fringe researchers. They held chairs at MIT and Frankfurt. And their conclusion was that the astronomical knowledge encoded in world mythology could not have been independently invented by each culture. It had to have come from a common source, a source predating the individual cultures, a source sophisticated enough to understand procession, to encode it deliberately in narrative form, and to distribute that encoding widely enough that it survived in cultures separated by the full breadth of human geographic spread. A common source. The civilization before. Hamlet's Mill has been in print continuously since 1969. It has been cited, challenged, partially refuted in specific details, and never adequately answered in its central claim. The processional encoding is there. The cross-cultural consistency is there. The common source remains the most parsimonious explanation, and the one that academic prehistory has the most structural difficulty accepting. Now the question of consciousness. Because the civilization before was not just technologically sophisticated, the evidence suggests it was sophisticatedly conscious in a way that the modern world is only beginning to approach from the scientific direction. The default mode network. This is a specific system of brain regions: medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, angular gyrus, medial temporal lobe, that activates when the brain is at rest and deactivates during focused external tasks. It was identified and named by Marcus Raichle of Washington University in St. Louis in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2001. For the first decade after its identification, the default mode network was understood primarily as the brain's resting state, what the brain does when it's not doing anything in particular. Then the research started showing what it actually does. The default mode network is active during self-referential thought, during remembering the past, during imagining the future, during understanding other people's minds, during moral reasoning, and, this is the connection, during the specific altered states of consciousness associated with mystical experience. When Newberg's subjects showed deactivation of the parietal lobe during deep meditation, the default mode network showed a simultaneous shift in its connectivity pattern. The two systems interact. The boundary dissolution that meditation produces, the disappearance of the felt separation between self and world, involves both the parietal lobe and the default mode network changing their relationship simultaneously. This has now been replicated across multiple research groups. Robin Carhart Harris of Imperial College London, now at the University of California, San Francisco, published landmark research in 2016 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, showing that psilocybin, the active compound in certain mushrooms, produces measurable changes in default mode network connectivity that correlate directly with the subjective experience of ego dissolution, the mystical experience, the felt disappearance of the boundary between self and world. the same experience that Mansur al-Hallaj described in Baghdad in 922 CE, that the Sufi tradition calls fana, that the Hindu tradition calls samadhi, that the Buddhist tradition calls sunyata, that the Gnostics encoded in the concept of epinoia, the thinking above thinking, the seventh transmission. Carhart-Harris's data showed something else. The degree of default mode network disruption correlated with the degree of subsequent psychological change in the subjects, their shift in values, their changes in behavior, their reported sense of meaning and connection. The more complete the dissolution of the default mode network's normal operating pattern, the more lasting the effect on the person. And the most complete dissolutions, the full mystical experiences, produced the most lasting changes. This is neurological data for what the priestly traditions encoded as initiation. The ritual that activates the NAM, the three elements of CBS 14061, spoken name, hand on head, ME object, producing multisensory integration that deactivates the parietal boundary simultaneously with shifting the default mode network. Ancient neurotechnology. Different instruments than fMRI and psilocybin, same system being accessed. Now the mushroom question specifically. Because it's impossible to discuss ancient consciousness technology without it, and it's been avoided in academic discourse for reasons that have less to do with evidence than with the social politics of the topic. R. Gordon Wasson was vice president of J.P. Morgan Bank and an amateur mycologist. In 1957, he published an article in Life magazine titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom," describing his experience with psilocybin mushrooms in a Mazatec ceremony in Oaxaca, Mexico, conducted by Maria Sabina, the last keeper of a tradition she told Wasson had been unbroken for thousands of years. The Life article reached millions of readers. It also ended Maria Sabina's ability to practice her tradition. The flood of Western seekers who came after Wasson's article disrupted the community irrevocably. Sabina died in poverty in 1985, having said that the mushrooms lost their power for her after Wasson came, because the secrets had been made public. Secrets made public. Rigmo, the open voice. The same dynamic that ended the first humanity. Wasson went on to collaborate with Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD in 1938 at Sandoz Laboratories, and classical scholar Carl Ruck of Boston University. Their 1978 book, The Road to Eleusis, published by Harcourt Brace Jovanovic, argued that the Eleusinian Mysteries, the most important religious institution of ancient Greece, practiced for approximately 2,000 years at Eleusis near Athens, attended by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, and every significant figure of the ancient world who could make the journey, were centered on the consumption of a psychoactive preparation, the kykeon. The ritual drink consumed at the culmination of the Eleusinian initiation. Wasson, Hofmann, and Ruck argued that the kykeon contained ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains ergotamine, the precursor from which Hofmann synthesized LSD. That the vision of Persephone, of death and rebirth, of the grain goddess descending and returning, the vision that initiates described as transforming their relationship to death permanently, was neurologically induced. Was the seventh transmission. Was the activation of the NAM through a biological compound rather than through meditation or years of priestly training. 2,000 years. The mysteries ran for approximately 2,000 years before being forcibly closed by the Christian emperor Theodosius in 392 CE. Every major mind of the ancient Greco-Roman world went through them. Plato's philosophy, his theory of the forms, his understanding of the soul, his cosmological vision, cannot be fully understood, Ruck argued, without understanding that Plato had the Eleusinian experience. That the allegory of the cave is not an intellectual construction, but a description of what happens when the default mode network fully shifts its connectivity pattern and the boundary between self and world dissolves. The cave is the default mode network's normal operating state. The light outside the cave is what Carhart-Harris's subjects described after the psilocybin sessions. Plato wasn't writing philosophy, he was writing phenomenology, description of direct experience. The experience the mysteries provided for 2,000 years to everyone who mattered in the ancient world. Theodosius closed them in 392 CE, the same year he closed all pagan temples. The Christian Empire, eliminating the consciousness technology of the civilization before, encoded in the mysteries, transmitted through 2,000 years of unbroken ritual, ended by imperial decree. What was lost when the mysteries closed? What the initiates knew that the uninitiated didn't, went underground. Into the alchemical tradition, into Neoplatonism, into the Sufi tradition that produced Al-Hallaj, into the Hermetic texts that produced Bruno, into the closed lines that Enki built to survive exactly this kind of systematic closure. The line doesn't break, but it compresses. Every time the open transmission is shut down, by Theodosius in 392, by the Inquisition burning Bruno in 1600, by the flood interrupting the 7th Upkalu, the knowledge goes further underground, more encoded, more hidden, more dependent on the carrier being able to hold it without falling asleep. Now the specific moment we're in. Because all of this, the archaeology, the genetics, the neuroscience, the acoustic research, the radar surveys, the Neroseti reading tablets, is happening simultaneously. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Multiple disciplines converging on the same gap at the same time, with tools sufficient to begin filling it. This has not happened before. Not at this scale, not with these instruments. The Aboriginal coastline traditions were confirmed by Marine Survey in 2016. Göbekli Tepe was dated definitively to 11,600 years ago in 1994, and excavation is ongoing. Less than 5% of the site has been uncovered. The BedMap 2 survey of subglacial Antarctica was published in 2013, and the resolution is already being exceeded by newer radar systems. The ancient DNA revolution began with the extraction of viable ancient genetic material from archaeological samples, a technology that became practical only in the early 2000s and that has already rewritten the entire history of human population movement. The default mode network was identified in 2001, and its relationship to mystical experience began being measured only after 2012, when the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to psilocybin research, and the dam of funding and institutional permission broke. These are not ancient dates. This convergence is happening now, in the last decade, in the last few years. The instruments for answering the question of what came before are becoming available at a pace that has no historical precedent. And every answer that's coming back is pointing in the same direction, toward the gap, toward something that existed in that gap, toward knowledge that survived the gap, encoded in stone and myth and genetic lines and ritual traditions, and the default mode network of human brains that experienced something and encoded the experience in the structure of the brain itself. The brain changes with mystical experience. Carhart Harris showed this. Newberg showed it. The change is measurable and lasting. It's encoded in the neural structure, not just remembered but physically instantiated. This means that the people who underwent Eleusinian initiation were neurologically different after than before. That 2,000 years of Greek and Roman civilization, every significant mind going through the mysteries, was a civilization partially composed of neurologically transformed individuals. And Theodosius ended it, in 392 CE, by imperial decree, the same year he burned the Serapeum, which held the remnant of the Alexandrian collection after the earlier fires. The same year he closed all temples throughout the empire. The same man, the same year, destroying the consciousness technology and the physical archive simultaneously. This was not coincidence. This was policy. Someone understood that the mysteries and the library were related, were two aspects of the same transmission, and closed both in the same year by the same authority. Who advised Theodosius? What they understood that we're only now beginning to reconstruct? These are questions without documented answers. The advisors are named. Ambrose of Milan, primarily. But what Ambrose understood about what he was closing what his theological reasoning actually rested on, is encoded in texts that are read as theology and not as strategic analysis of consciousness technology. Read as strategic analysis of consciousness technology. The closure of the mysteries and the library in 392 CE is the most significant deliberate interruption of the transmission since the flood. Since Enlil's council voted and the waters came. Same structure, same decision. The open transmission has become dangerous. Close it. Not because the knowledge is wrong, because the knowledge is right, and right knowledge in the wrong hands, at the wrong scale, without the filter of the priestly line, without the protocol of initiation, without the preparation to hold it without falling asleep. Wrong knowledge. Theodosius was Enlil. Ambrose was the council. The mysteries were the seventh Apkallu without his determinative. And the line went underground again, into the alchemy, into the Sufis, into the Hermetic tradition, into the closed schools that survived by being invisible, into the document that a peasant found digging for fertilizer in 1945 in a field in Egypt, into the Nag Hammadi codices that the church had been trying to destroy for 4 centuries, into the texts that described epinoia, the thinking above thinking, the seventh transmission, in language that matched what Carhart Harris would measure on an fMRI scanner 1,500 years later. The structure holds, across every attempt to close it. Because Nam Gara Nu Ub Tabayan. What is embedded does not get extracted back. Not by Theodosius, not by the Inquisition, not by the flood. What remains is the question of the seventh condition, the broken tablet, the line after the seventh Apkallu and before the flood that nobody has read yet because nobody has put Ithaca and BM 85942 and the 48 IMI tablets together in the same room at the same time. Nobody publicly. What the seventh condition says, what completes the transmission, what constitutes the full activation of what was embedded, is the question that all of this has been building toward. The maps point to it. The stone encodes it. The myths remember it. The neuroscience is measuring it. The genetics is tracing the line that carries it. 25,920 years. The full processional cycle. The great mill grinding through its complete turn. We are at a specific point in that cycle now. Not at its end, not at its beginning, but at a specific position that the ancient astronomical traditions marked as significant. The position that Göbekli Tepe's builders chose when they aligned their monument with Deneb as it occupied the north celestial pole 11,600 years ago. They were marking a position in the precessional cycle, a specific moment in the great mill's turn, the same moment, measured forward by one full cycle. 25,920 years lands within the period we are in now. Within the last several centuries, within the next several centuries. The precision of ancient astronomical tradition doesn't allow a more specific date, and that's appropriate. IMI doesn't mean it happens on a specific date. IMI means it happens because it's embedded. Because what is embedded cannot be extracted back. The civilization before didn't end. It's waiting in the stone and the myth and the line and the broken tablet and the neural structures of human brains that have held the seventh transmission without falling asleep. The maps were wrong. Then they were right. The stone was silent. Then the radar spoke. The tablets were broken. Then the neural network read 100,000 at once and found the thread. The default mode network was unknown. Then it was measured. Then its relationship to the oldest human experience of boundary dissolution was confirmed in peer-reviewed literature. Everything is being confirmed. One instrument at a time, one discovery at a time. Not because someone planned it, because what is embedded surfaces, because the mill turns, because Nam Gara Nu Ub Tabayan. And somewhere in the archive at the Ohio State University Byrd Polar Research Center, in the restricted portions of a diary written in 1946 by a man who went south with 4,700 personnel and 13 ships and came back 8 months early without explanation. Somewhere in those pages is something he saw beneath the ice that made him end the expedition and never speak publicly about why. The ice remembers too. It always has. There is one place on Earth where 3 separate lines of evidence converge on the same coordinates. Not approximately the same, the same. Within margins that eliminate coincidence as an explanation. The coordinates are 29 degrees, 58 minutes north, 31 degrees, 8 minutes east. The Great Pyramid of Giza. The first line of evidence is astronomical. The 3 pyramids of the Giza Plateau, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, are arranged in a pattern that matches the 3 belt stars of Orion with a precision that has been measured and confirmed. Robert Bauval, a construction engineer working in the 1980s, noticed this and published it with Adrian Gilbert in The Orion Mystery in 1994 through William Heinemann. The angular offset between the 3 pyramids matches the angular offset between Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, the belt stars. Not as they appear now, but as they appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE. The ground mirrors the sky, but not the current sky. The sky from 12,500 years ago. The second line is geological. Robert Schoch's rainfall weathering analysis of the Sphinx enclosure, already discussed, places the construction of the Sphinx before the desert came, before 5000 BCE, in the period of the African humid period. If the Sphinx was built in that period, and the Sphinx faces due east toward the sunrise, and the Sphinx was built in alignment with the Giza complex, then the Giza complex was being planned, or its location established, during the same period that the Orion correlation points to. The same period. 10,500 BCE, 12,500 years ago. The third line is geodetic. The Great Pyramid sits at a location that is not random. It sits at the exact intersection of the longest line of longitude and the longest line of latitude that pass over land. The longitude line passing through the Great Pyramid, 31 degrees 8 minutes east, passes over more land surface than any other longitude line. The latitude line, 29 degrees 58 minutes north, passes over more land surface than any other latitude line. The probability of this being coincidence, given the total surface area of the Earth and the precision of the placement, has been calculated by multiple researchers and is effectively 0 at any reasonable significance threshold. Somebody chose that specific point on the surface of the Earth intentionally. Somebody knew enough about global geodesy, the measurement and mathematical representation of the Earth's shape and size, to identify the intersection of the longest land-crossing lines of longitude and latitude, and built there. Global geodesy at that level requires knowing the circumference of the Earth. Knowing the circumference requires either orbital observation or systematic measurement across thousands of kilometers with sufficient mathematical framework to calculate the curvature. The circumference is encoded in the pyramid's dimensions. The pyramid sits at the geodetic center of the landmass. These are not 2 separate facts. They are the same fact stated twice. The people who built the pyramid knew where they were on the surface of the Earth with a precision that modern GPS confirms, and that the civilization before possessed, and the civilization after spent millennia trying to recover. Eratosthenes is credited with measuring the circumference of the Earth in approximately 240 BCE, placing a stick in the ground at Alexandria and calculating the angle of the shadow at noon on the summer solstice, comparing it with the angle at Syene, doing the geometry. He got within 2%. This was considered one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid encodes the circumference to within 0.1%, 2,300 years before Eratosthenes, by a civilization that supposedly didn't know the Earth was round. The civilization before knew, encoded it in the stone, built at the geodetic center to prove it, and then the gap. The knowledge compressed, went underground, and Eratosthenes with his stick and his shadow was celebrated for recovering a fraction of what had been fully known millennia before him. This is the pattern. Not gradual progress from ignorance toward knowledge. Compression, loss, partial recovery, compression again. The mill grinding through its cycle. Knowledge available at one point in the cycle, buried at another, surfacing as the mill turns. Now the chamber. Because the Great Pyramid contains something that has never been adequately explained, and that becomes significantly more interesting when read against everything discussed so far. The King's Chamber. A room of red Aswan granite, 10.45 meters by 5.20 meters by 5.80 meters high, located at the heart of the pyramid. In it, a lidless granite coffer. No mummy was ever found in it, no grave goods, no inscription, nothing. A room of precise dimensions, precise acoustic properties, no burial function that has ever been demonstrated. The acoustic properties are specific. John Reed, an acoustic engineer, conducted measurements inside the King's Chamber in 2000 and published results showing that the chamber resonates at frequencies between 100 and 200 hertz, the frequency range of the human voice. Specifically, the chamber amplifies male chanting voices in a way that produces standing waves, stationary sound patterns that fill the room with nodes and antinodes of pressure, creating a physical acoustic field that the human body can feel as vibration. Standing waves in the King's Chamber at the frequency of human chanting. This is not a burial chamber. This is an acoustic instrument, built to do something specific with human voice at a specific frequency inside a specific volume of granite. John Stuart Reed, the same acoustic engineer, placed a tonoscope, a device that visualizes sound patterns by showing how sound vibrates a membrane covered in fine particles, inside the King's Chamber. At specific frequencies, the sound patterns on the tonoscope membrane matched the hieroglyphic symbol for mer, the ancient Egyptian word for the pyramid itself. The pyramid's name, produced in physical form by the pyramid's own acoustic resonance. Mer. The sound of the pyramid, made visible, spells the pyramid's name in its own writing system. This is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of architecture, or it is deliberate. The pyramid encoding its own name in its acoustic signature, accessible to anyone who knows to look. Who knows to look? That is always the question. Who knows what instrument to bring, what frequency to use, what question to ask of the stone? The stone answers the right questions. It has always answered the right questions. The Pythagorean geometry at Stonehenge answers when someone brings a computer analysis of the ground plan. The subglacial coastline answers when someone brings a radar survey. The acoustic signature of the King's Chamber answers when someone brings a tonoscope. The 100,000 tablets answer when someone brings a neural network trained on all of them simultaneously. The answers have been waiting in the stone. The instruments to receive them have been arriving one by one. The King's Chamber has been resonating at 100 to 200 hertz for 4,500 years, since the day it was sealed, since the day the granite was placed and the acoustic volume was established, waiting for someone to bring a microphone and a tonoscope and ask what the room does when a human voice sings inside it. The room says mer. The pyramid says its own name. In the frequency of human chanting, in the Chladni figure visible in sand, in the hieroglyph that every Egyptian knew was the word for pyramid. This is consciousness technology. Not metaphorically. The King's Chamber was built to do something to human consciousness, to the consciousness of a person inside it, chanting at the resonant frequency, experiencing the standing waves in their body, feeling the vibration in their sternum and skull, experiencing the parietal boundary dissolution that Newberg measured with SPECT and Carhart-Harris confirmed with psilocybin, and Al-Hallaj described in Baghdad, and the Eleusinian initiates experienced for 2,000 years in the underground chamber at Eleusis. Different instruments, same system. The pyramid is the instrument the civilization before built for this purpose. Permanent, indestructible by the gap, by the flood, by the compression of the dark period. The mysteries at Eleusis used biology, the kykeon, the ergot preparation. The pyramid uses physics, acoustic resonance, standing waves, granite at a specific frequency, both accessing the same neural system, both producing the same shift in default mode network connectivity, both delivering what the priestly tradition called activation of the NAM, what Carhart Harris calls ego dissolution, what the Sufis call fana, what Plato encoded in the allegory of the cave, what the seventh Apkallu without his determinative brought before the flood interrupted the transmission. The pyramid is the transmission that couldn't be interrupted. The flood came. The dark period came. Theodosius came. The Inquisition came. The library burned multiple times. The mysteries were closed. The Eleusinian underground chamber was sealed with rubble. The tablets were stolen in 2003. The priestly lines compressed to invisibility. The pyramid stood, is still standing, still resonating at 100 to 200 hertz, still encoding pi and the circumference of the earth and the Pythagorean relationships and the acoustic frequency of its own name in every dimension simultaneously, still sitting at the geodetic center of the landmass, still aligned with Orion's belt as it appeared 12,500 years ago, pointing back to the date of the civilization before. The pyramid is the message in a bottle, sealed by the civilization before and placed at the geodetic center of the Earth's landmass, the most findable point, the intersection of the most land, the location that any global civilization would eventually reach, containing everything they knew in a form that couldn't burn, couldn't be mistranslated, couldn't be deliberately altered, couldn't be lost in transmission. Couldn't be lost because it is the transmission. The medium is the message. The pyramid doesn't contain the knowledge. The pyramid is the knowledge, expressed in stone, in geometry, in acoustics, in astronomy, in geodesy, simultaneously, redundantly, at every scale from the architectural to the atomic. Now what the pyramid's interior was actually used for. Because the absence of any burial, no mummy, no grave goods, no inscription on the walls of the king's chamber, nothing, has been explained by Egyptologists as robbing. The tombs were robbed, the mummy is gone, the goods are gone. This explanation has a problem. The Great Pyramid was sealed in antiquity. The ascending passage was blocked by massive granite plugs that were in place when the Arab explorer Al-Mamun tunneled in around 820 CE. The plugs were still in place. The chamber had not been entered, and it was empty, not robbed, never occupied in the way a burial chamber is occupied. The coffer is lidless. A sarcophagus without a lid is not a sarcophagus. It is a resonator, a rectangular granite vessel with interior dimensions that produce specific acoustic frequencies when struck or when sound is projected into them. The coffer's interior dimensions produce resonances in the same range as the chamber itself. The coffer and the chamber are tuned to each other acoustically, a nested resonant system, chamber within pyramid, coffer within chamber, each reinforcing the same frequency range. A person lying in the coffer, which is the right size for a person, would experience the acoustic resonance through their entire body simultaneously. Every surface of the granite in contact with the body, the chamber resonating above and around, the frequency range of human chanting filling the space, standing waves creating pressure nodes that the body feels as something between vibration and silence. This is the initiation chamber, not the burial chamber, the chamber where the seventh transmission happens, where a person prepared by years of priestly training, who has concentrated enough nam through lineage and practice, who will not fall asleep holding what they're given, lies in the granite coffer and receives what the pyramid was built to deliver. What it delivers is the activation, the parietal dissolution, the default mode network shift, the direct experience of what Al-Hallaj described and was killed for saying publicly. What the Eleusinian initiates experienced and returned from permanently changed. What Plato encoded in the allegory of the cave and called the highest form of knowledge. The pyramid delivers it through physics, through the acoustic properties of granite and geometry and the specific volume of a room cut to specific dimensions, without biology, without the kikion, without the years of meditation practice that produced the Sufi fana, just stone and frequency and a person prepared enough to hold the experience without losing consciousness. Prepared enough. Zuitsuadra knew and was silent. Gilgamesh held the plant but fell asleep. The pyramid does not care how famous you are, how intelligent you are, how much you want the experience. The preparation is everything. The Nam concentrated through generations of priestly practice. The Igigal, the big ear, the capacity to receive without the system shutting down in protection. The coffer is still there. The chamber is still resonating. The pyramid is still standing at the geodetic center of the landmass, still aligned with Orion's belt as it was 12,500 years ago, still encoding pi and the circumference of the Earth and the acoustic signature of its own name. Waiting. As it has always been waiting. Not for everyone. The stone doesn't care about everyone. Waiting for the person who arrives prepared, who knows what instrument to bring, who knows what frequency to use, who will not fall asleep. The civilization before built something that cannot be destroyed by flood or fire or imperial decree or the passage of 12,000 years. They built the message into the geometry of the stone itself, into ratios that are mathematical constants, that cannot be mistranslated, that are as true now as they were when the granite was placed. They built the delivery mechanism into the physics of the chamber, into acoustic resonance that doesn't require a priest to explain it, that works the same way regardless of what language you speak, or what century you were born in, or what religion your empire happens to profess. They built it at the center of the world, where every global civilization would eventually find it. And they left it running. 4,500 years of continuous acoustic resonance at 100 to 200 hertz in a sealed granite chamber. The longest running instrument in human history. Still tuned. Still waiting for the right voice to sing inside it and hear what the stone has been saying since the day it was sealed. Mer. The pyramid says its own name. It has been saying it for 4,500 years. The question is not whether there is a message. The question is whether we are ready to hear it without falling asleep. Giza, 29 degrees 58 minutes north, 31 degrees 8 minutes east, the geodetic center of the landmass. The mill turns. Nam gara nu ub tabeen. The stone remembers everything. It always has. It is still saying it, right now, at a frequency the human body was built to receive, a frequency the civilization before knew and encoded and placed at the center of the world and sealed inside granite and left running for whoever arrives prepared enough to lie down in the coffer and not fall asleep. The coffer is empty. It is waiting.